How's it going, everybody? In this video, I will be doing a quick summary and review of the case of Charles Dexter Ward by none other than H.P. Lovecraft. So, once again, another spoiler warning if you have never read this story or listened to it. I highly recommend it. It's another very good one by Lovecraft. So, let's begin. The story starts out about a boy named Charles Dexter Ward. It describes his early life as a boy and how he was very much into genealogy, antiques, history, that sort of thing. Well, throughout his early life, he ends up discovering that he has a great-great-grandfather who all record of which was removed, or at least attempted to have been removed. There were still clues and such that Charles had found. And throughout the whole part of the story, he finds out that his great-great-grandmother ended up changing her name back to her maiden name after her husband, Joseph Curwen, died. Because Joseph Curwen was into some really dark, messed up stuff, and the great-great-grandmother didn't want to have anything to do with that. So, the story of Joseph Curwen goes back to the 1690s, where he flees from Salem to Providence, Rhode Island, in order to avoid the witch trials that were going on at the time. Now, he was in his mid-30s, and he was a very strange man, kind of kept to himself, was into some very strange things that the people of Providence were kind of questioning. And as the years goes on, everybody notices that he's not aging. So by the time that it gets to the 1740s and 1750s, when he really should be in his 80s or in his 90s, an old man, he still looks like he's in his 30s. So quite a few people start to question what the heck is going on. He runs several shipping companies, or one big shipping company, a lot of different ships and stuff like that, and sailors of his mysteriously disappear. But it's only ever like one or two. And there's even one point where a group of British soldiers back in 1763 end up going missing. And what's strange about that is that it's higher than the expected desertion rate at the time. So people are really starting to question what the heck's going on with this guy. Well, in order for him to throw people off of the scent, he ends up getting married to the daughter of one of his captains. He kind of blackmails the captain into it, and Joseph Curwen forces the captain to break off the engagement between his daughter and a young sailor. Well, the young sailor is pretty ticked off about it, and so whenever he's not at sea and he's back in port in Providence, he starts to do an investigation on his own into Joseph Curwen. Well, Curwen has his own farm kind of out in the middle of nowhere near Pawtuxet, and there's all sorts of strange sounds and screams and stuff like that going on, and Curwen also buys all sorts of very strange chemical stuff from people, from chemists, and a lot of people think that he's into grave robbing and taking bodies from graveyards and such. So a lot of really weird stuff going on. And the sailor gets one of his friends to spy on Kerwin whenever the sailor is not in port and out at sea doing his job. Well, over the period of a few years, these two young men end up, well, during their investigation, they kind of have a general idea of the stuff that Kerwin is into. And so they take it to another ship captain and several prominent people in the community, including a former governor. And they all decide that, hey, this Kerwin guy needs to go. So they plan a raid on Kerwin's farm. They conduct the raid, they kill Kerwin, and everybody who's involved in that raid, who was actually at the farm and saw everything that was going on, just swear to silence. And there's all sorts of really weird, crazy stuff that goes on during the raid and everything. Well, all of this stuff kind of piques Charles Ward's interest in his ancestor. And eventually, he ends up finding the old home in Providence, in the town itself, where Kerwin lived with his wife and daughter. And he ends up finding a portrait of Kerwin that is painted on a panel over a fireplace. And he has the painting restored because it was covered under all sorts of layers of paint. And he hires people to remove that paneling and the fireplace and stuff like that that was around there to take it back to his home. And when they do that, they find a small cavity behind where the painting was, and what was in there was the diary and notes of Joseph Kerwin and all of the scientific, quote-unquote, experiments that he was conducting. And there was all sorts of letters and manuscripts and such things. Well, Ward takes that to his home, where it's his parents' home that he's living out of, and he starts doing all these different experiments and stuff up in their attic. And the parents hear all sorts of strange chantings and stuff like conversations and whatnot. And eventually there's, on a Good Friday in the 1920s, there's this crazy thunderstorm that just comes out of nowhere, and the house and everything is shaking, and a cold wind blowing in from the sea, and everybody's freaking out. And they could hear their son chanting this incantation and stuff like that, and then all of a sudden the storm stops, and they're wondering what the heck's going on. And later on, they hear Charles having like a conversation with someone, but Charles is being very, very secretive. Well, the family knows a doctor who helps the family to try to see what the heck's going on with their son and everything. I think he's a psychiatrist. But anyways, eventually all of these different experiments and such, including some grave robbing, because Charles ends up finding the hidden grave of Joseph Kerwin, steals the casket and the body and brings it home. And that was before the thunderstorm and everything on Good Friday. Well, eventually Charles ends up buying this bungalow up on a hill near Pawtuxet, and him and this man, well, actually, you know what? Crap, I'm getting ahead of myself. I'm sorry, I tend to do that quite a bit. Well, anyways, Charles, before the whole bungalow thing, he wants to go to Europe in order to find out more about this science stuff that he is getting into. Well, his parents at first were telling him no, that, you know, he wasn't old enough and such, but then a few years goes on and he finally gets old enough and they can't really stop him. So he goes and travels Europe and meets with some different mystics and magicians and learns all sorts of stuff from them. And then he comes back to Providence and all of that other stuff with the grave robbing and the thunderstorm ends up happening after that. So, back to the bungalow. Charles ends up buying this bungalow, and there's two men that are living there and working there with him, one of which is a doctor, quote unquote, calls himself Dr. Allen. He's got sunglasses and a beard that he always wears. And a lot of weird, strange stuff takes place at the bungalow. People smelling all sorts of very strange, disgusting smells, seeing lights in the middle of the night, abnormal amounts of food and meat being brought to the bungalow and everything. Well, eventually, Charles gets really, really frightened of Dr. Allen, sends a letter to his family's doctor, Dr. Willett, begging him for help. And Charles is very much afraid of Dr. Allen, and in his note, he was saying how he's afraid that Dr. Allen's going to kill him, and that the only way to stop Dr. Allen is to kill him and dissolve his body in acid. Yeah, really, really freaky, creepy guy. And in the letter that Charles sent to Dr. Willett, Charles mentions that he's not going to go anywhere and that he needs about 5 or 6 hours to be able to talk to Dr. Willett and explain everything. Well, Dr. Willett clears his day and ends up heading over there by about 4 p.m. And when he gets there, Charles is gone. He starts asking what happened, and they said that Charles had come into the home and nobody had seen him leave. Charles had come into the home, went upstairs. They heard some really weird stuff like thumping and whatnot, and then Charles ended up leaving later. Well, Dr. Willett and Charles's father kind of take up the investigation and go over to the bungalow to talk to Charles, and they end up... So this is going on over a period of like weeks, months, that sort of thing. Eventually, Charles gets placed into a psychiatric ward because there's all sorts of stuff about him that is very, very different. He speaks differently. He's acting very strangely. And when they admit him to the hospital, there's things about his body that had changed. For example, Charles had a birthmark on his hip that wasn't there anymore, and a black mark on his chest that used to not be there but all of a sudden appeared, and even a scar above his right eye that used to not be there. Well, the doctor, Dr. Willett, and the father end up exploring the bungalow, and they find in the cellar a hidden manhole that leads down into this crazy underground network of tunnels and such. When they open up the tunnel, the smell of it is so bad that it causes Charles's father to faint, and Dr. Willett goes down there alone. He ends up finding a library with all sorts of different chemistry books and occult books, things of that nature. Well, during Dr. Willett's exploration, he finds this altar with very strange, evil carvings on the altar, and the altar is stained, which I believe it is stained with blood from different sacrifices. So Charles got into some very, very dark stuff. Well, inside of the room with this altar, there are these stones that have holes cut into them where Dr. Willett can hear things down there, things that are alive. He opens up one of these holes and looks into there with his flashlight, and he sees this creature in there that scares him so badly that he drops his flashlight. And throughout the exploration of this cave network, Dr. Willett ends up finding the actual laboratory, and he finds all of these different salts that are hidden down there, and that's when Dr. Willett realizes that those salts came from humans and animals, that Charles was, and well, more Dr. Allen was getting into quite a bit of grave robbing, taking bodies and mummies and stuff like that were being imported from Egypt and such, to break them down into these salts, and then using black magic be able to revive those people and find out certain things from them. So Dr. Willett eventually figures out that the Charles that they had brought into the asylum was not Charles. It was, in fact, Joseph Kerwin, who had been resurrected. Now, Joseph Kerwin looked exactly like Charles. The only difference, major difference, being that scar above Joseph's right eye. So Dr. Willett, when he's down there in the laboratory, sees some different carvings on the wall that he had seen in all the different notes from Charles and from Joseph Kerwin. And close to the altar, close to this wall, there's this concave portion of the floor that has some of these salts in it. Well, Dr. Willett ends up reading the inscription aloud, and it summons something using the salts. All Dr. Willett saw was like this black purplish haze and everything. He ends up fainting, and the next thing that he knows, he's back in the bungalow. And Charles's dad comes to see what happened, and they go down into the cellar to see where the manhole was, and all of that was covered up, cemented up, like it wasn't even there. Well, Dr. Willett feels around in his pocket and sees a note saying how Joseph Kerwin needs to die. And it's all written in Latin. This note is written in Latin and saying how basically what Charles had begged Dr. Willett before to kill Dr. Allen, aka Joseph Kerwin, and dissolve his body in acid. Well, Dr. Willett takes a little bit of time off to plan everything out, and well, actually no, before that, him and Charles's father go back home, and Dr. Willett goes up to where the mantle place that had the portrait of Joseph Kerwin was. He locks himself in there, doesn't let anybody come in, and the father and the servants living in that mansion, they hear Dr. Willett rummaging around up there and looking around, and Dr. Willett comes out and says, "Hey, we need a bunch of wood." And that's when everybody starts smelling something really, really bad. So Dr. Willett locks himself in there again, and he starts a fire in a fireplace, and the servants outside could see how the smoke ends up becoming very black and acrid smoke. And after a while, the smoke clears out, and they can hear Dr. Willett sweeping and scraping stuff into a pan. Well, Dr. Willett eventually comes out and doesn't really tell anybody what he was doing. So Dr. Willett goes home, takes a little bit of time off to plan everything, and he writes a letter to Charles's father saying, look, Charles is going to go missing from the asylum. He's not going to be there. Here in about a year, put a tombstone in this spot, because that's where Charles is going to be buried. He's going to be dead a year from now. So Dr. Willett goes to the asylum and confronts Joseph Curwen. Joseph Curwen starts to, once he knows that he's been had and that he's been exposed, he begins to chant some incantation in Latin, which Dr. Willett counters with his own that he had learned down there in those crypts, catacombs, whatever you want to call them. And Curwen is no more. He ends up dying. And, well, that's the end of the story. It's a really, really good one. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I really loved how the suspense was built up over time. And, yeah, it was a really cool reveal towards the end, even though there's plenty of clues and such throughout the whole story that really links everything together. So, sorry about that. So, it's like I said, it's really neat. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and yeah, that's another one of Lovecraft's better works, in my opinion. So yeah, let me know what you guys think. The next video that I'm going to be making is going to be another 2 stories, since both of them were shorter. They will be The Cats of Ulthar and Celophaeus, 2 other short stories by H.P. Lovecraft. So, thanks. Hope you guys have a wonderful day. I'm driving through Nevada, getting a bit closer to Las Vegas. I'm probably still about 2 or so hours away from Las Vegas. I'm sure that you guys have noticed all of the haze. That's still the smoke from those fires in Oregon, and I believe California too. But it's finally starting to thin out. So, yeah, pretty big, nasty fires. Anyways, take care, and thanks for watching.